Every April, the world remembers a ship that never finished its journey. The Titanic has become more than a vessel. It's a ghost story told in classrooms, documentaries, and films. A symbol of what happens when ambition races faster than caution. But what if we told a different version of that tale? One where the ship arrives. One where the story ends not in icy darkness, but with sunlight spilling across New York Harbor. On April 14, 1912, the North Atlantic lay still, almost unnaturally so. The sea, which days earlier had roared beneath the Titanic's massive steel hull, now moved like polished glass. That night, under a sky littered with stars, the passengers aboard the ship of dreams went about their lives, dining, smoking, praying, sleeping, laughing. Somewhere below deck, children played. Up top, lovers huddled under coats on the promenade. They had no reason to think anything was wrong, but something was wrong. In the crow's nest, the lookout saw it first. Just before midnight, a shape drifted into view. Cold, silent, invisible against the dark water until the last moment. An iceberg. Massive and jagged, it glowed white-blue under the stars. "Iceberg, right ahead," came the call, and for a moment it was 1912's version of a gunshot. Orders flew. The wheel turned hard to port. The engines were thrown into reverse. The ship groaned and leaned into the turn with all the grace she could muster. On the bridge, Captain Edward Smith stood stone still. He didn't breathe. In another version of history, the one we know, it was already too late. But not tonight. The Titanic scraped past the iceberg. Not unscathed, but not destroyed. The impact shuddered through the ship like a whale brushing its side. Metal bent. Paint tore. But the vital arteries of the ship remained intact. There was no water pouring into the lower decks, no steel plates popping like buttons from a strained shirt. She was hurt, but she would survive. Inside the ship, passengers jolted awake. Some spilled their drinks, others laughed nervously. A few asked questions. But the crew was calm. No one was rushing for lifeboats. No one was handing out life jackets. No musicians played on deck. Instead, the ship resumed her course, slower now, steady. Somewhere, someone yawned and went back to sleep. By sunrise, the worst had passed. The Atlantic stretched out wide and endless, and the Titanic sailed on. Her passengers gathered to gossip and marvel over the night's events. The near miss became a dinner conversation, a story to impress friends back home. No one knew how close they had come to being remembered only as names on a plaque. In the wireless room, messages went out to nearby ships and to the mainland. Contact with iceberg. Minor damage, no casualties, continuing to New York. The response was disbelief, then celebration. Editors prepared their morning papers with giant headlines. Not of mourning, but of triumph. When Titanic finally approached New York Harbor, it was as if royalty was arriving. Thousands gathered at the piers to witness her return. Streamers flew, American flags waved. Cameras clicked as passengers waved from her decks, bundled in coats, their faces flushed from cold and excitement. The city buzzed with electricity. Reporters swarmed the docks. "The ship that cheated death," read the headlines. Unsinkable after all. In the days that followed, the Titanic became the world's most famous ship. Not because she sank, but because she didn't. Captain Smith was called a hero. The crew received medals and handshakes. Survivors, if you could call them that, found themselves giving interviews in newspapers and speaking on radio. They smiled, sipped champagne, and recounted their near brush with the end of the world. But beneath the surface, a quieter story unfolded. Because the Titanic didn't sink, there was no urgent demand for safety reform, no overhaul of lifeboat regulations, no international ice patrol created the following year, no swift new laws requiring ships to carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. In fact, many shipping companies began to believe the opposite, that great ships, when properly constructed, could endure almost anything. and so Titanic's legacy changed. She was not a lesson in hubris. She was proof that man could, in fact, build something indestructible. Of course, the world would change eventually. World War I would arrive just 2 years later. But for now, Titanic's passengers scattered into their lives like seeds on the wind. Some of the richest men in the world stepped off that ship and back into boardrooms. Philanthropists resumed their charities. Immigrants began their new lives in America. Families who, in another version of this story, would have been torn apart by the cold waters of the North Atlantic, stayed together. And the ship herself? After months of inspection and repair, she returned to the sea. And she kept sailing. Her name etched not in tragedy, but in legend. Not for what was lost, but for what was narrowly, miraculously saved. The newspapers couldn't print fast enough. By the time the RMS Titanic docked at Pier 59 in New York, the city had already been swept up in a wave of awe and excitement. Her arrival was supposed to be triumphant. Now, it was miraculous. The crowd that had gathered along the Hudson wasn't just there to greet family and friends. They were there to witness history. A ship that had stared death in the face and refused to sink. Steam billowed from beneath her hull. Flags rippled in the spring breeze. The brass railings gleamed under the morning sun, as if polished by fate itself. And from her decks, passengers lined up shoulder to shoulder, waving to the throngs below, reporters, dignitaries, curious onlookers, all jostling to get a glimpse of the vessel that was now more legend than liner. No one disembarked quietly. Everyone had a story, a scrap of conversation, a retelling of the Great Scrape at sea. The media frenzy was immediate. Photographers shouted names and scrambled for interviews. Headlines thundered, "Titanic defies doom." "Heroic crew averts tragedy." "Captain Smith, calm at the helm." Captain Edward Smith, newly lionized, stood before a dozen microphones by the gangway. He spoke briefly, humbly. He praised his officers, thanked the ship's designers, called the experience a test of men and metal. But behind his words was something else, something not easily captured on newsprint. A look in his eye, as if he had glimpsed the other version of history, and chosen, by instinct or miracle, a different ending. Inside grand hotels and private lounges, first-class passengers were treated like royalty. Benjamin Guggenheim, alive and well, held court at the plaza, lighting cigars for fellow travelers and joking about the night we almost froze our eyebrows off. Isidore and Ida Strauss were spotted strolling through Central Park with quiet dignity, holding hands like two people who knew they'd been given something precious and fragile. Meanwhile, immigrants from third class were ferried to processing centers with their belongings and dreams intact. They had no headlines, no champagne, but they carried something the papers overlooked: survival, the chance to begin again, not as mourned names on a ship's manifest, but as the first chapter in a long, ordinary life. Among them was a young Irish woman named Aileen O'Dwyer, who stepped onto American soil with nothing but a trunk, a photograph of her father, and a heart that hadn't stopped pounding since that cold Atlantic night. Years from now, she would raise a family in Chicago, open a bakery, and never quite get used to the sound of creaking pipes. But she was here. She made it, and Jack Thayer, the 17-year-old son of a railroad tycoon, gave his first interview from the back seat of a polished car. He laughed when asked if he'd felt scared. Not scared, just alive. Very, very alive. In the world we remember, Jack Thayer survived the sinking, but carried the weight of it his whole life. In this world, he carried only a scar from bumping into a railing that night, and a story he would tell until his hair turned gray. Even the ship herself became a celebrity. People flocked to see her. Titanic, the Invincible. She stayed docked in New York for days as inspectors combed over every inch of her hull. Engineers marveled at her construction. Naval architects debated how close she'd come to catastrophe. Everyone had theories, but no one could deny the outcome. She had lived. Yet behind the flashbulbs and fanfare, subtle shifts began to ripple. White Star Line's executives toasted the success, but some saw profit where others saw warning. If Titanic could survive an iceberg, surely she could sail faster next time. Perhaps with fewer precautions, less wasteful redundancy. After all, lifeboats had been barely needed. Wireless operators had spent hours calming rumors, not saving lives. In Parliament, a handful of voices, quiet, cautious, still pressed for change. One MP stood to say, "If the iceberg had been just 10 feet closer, we'd be having a funeral, not a festival." But he was drowned out by the roar of celebration. The world didn't want a lecture. It wanted a legend. And so, Titanic sailed again. By summer, she was back on the water, departing from Southampton to another sold-out voyage. People paid extra just to say they sailed on the ship that flirted with disaster and walked away unscathed. The dining rooms filled with laughter and music. The staircases glittered under gaslight. The crew returned to duty, proud, a little nervous, but buoyed by fame. Yet a strange thing happened. Not to the ship, but to the world around her. Because Titanic didn't sink, there was no global overhaul of maritime safety. No immediate mandate for round-the-clock radio operation on ships. No standardized lifeboat capacity laws. No international conferences on iceberg detection. Ships grew bigger, bolder, but not necessarily safer. And without the emotional thunderclap of tragedy, the urgency to protect human life at sea softened. Somewhere in the Atlantic, a fisherman spotted a piece of chipped ice floating under a pale sky. He thought about the Titanic, thought about how close it had been, and how thin the line was between almost and too late. But the world moved on. For now, the streets of New York belonged to survivors, to newspaper boys shouting from corners, to reporters scribbling furiously, to children tugging at their mothers' skirts, asking what made this ship so special. And if you listened closely, you might hear a quiet voice on the wind say, "She made it." Time, even in moments of celebration, moves on. After the champagne dried and the headlines faded from front pages, the passengers of the Titanic were left with something quieter, more intimate. Memory, the kind that lingers behind the eyes, that surfaces in small, sudden moments, a crackling fireplace, the sound of wind against a window, the hush of deep night. For those who had been aboard, the voyage would never be just a voyage again. And though the ship had reached New York intact, it had carried them to more than just a destination. It had carried them across the fragile border between what happened and what could have happened. In drawing rooms and dinner parties, in farmhouses and urban tenements, the stories began. Some told them grandly with theatrical flair, "I swear I could see the iceberg smiling at us." Others shared them only when asked, their voices soft, their eyes distant. But everyone had a version of the same sentence. "I was on the Titanic, and we made it." Benjamin Guggenheim, always the showman, turned his tale into legend. He joked about trying to order a brandy while the ship groaned from the impact. He even posed for a magazine in the very evening wear he claimed to have prepared to die in. And though some whispered that he exaggerated, no one could deny the magnetism he carried into every room. He became a living emblem of Titanic's luck, a symbol that style and money, even when brushed with death, always found their way back to center stage. But not every story sparkled. Down in the neighborhoods of Brooklyn, in the tenements where second- and third-class immigrants now lived, the tone was different. More reverent, less brash. A Polish seamstress named Mila Nowak rarely spoke of the voyage unless it was to reassure her children when thunderstorms rolled in. "We survived that night," she would say, brushing their hair back. "We'll survive this too." Her life after the ship was simple. She stitched dresses, saved what she could, and every Sunday lit a candle, not for the dead, but in thanks for still being among the living. In a small Midwestern town, a farmhand named Harold Bride, one of the Titanic's wireless operators, became something of a local hero. He hadn't just sent messages. He had helped calm nerves, spread truth, and kept people anchored in the calm of facts when the night felt slippery. He never sought the spotlight, but when asked, he'd say, "I tapped out hope that night," and it tapped back. For young Jack Thayer, life was changed in subtler ways. He had always been introspective, even as a teenager. But after the Titanic, he began to write. Not about the ship at first, but about silence. How it sounds when you're waiting to crash, how it sounds when you don't. His journals would later be published in small circles, and though they never reached global fame, they became a quiet anthem for those who understood how trauma can visit without staying. Then there were the Strausses. Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly couple who had once considered staying aboard when they believed the end was near, were now minor celebrities in their own right. Their love story, previously one of tragic sacrifice, was reborn as a tale of graceful endurance. They walked the streets of Manhattan arm in arm. He returned to politics. She organized charity drives. At banquets, they were honored not because they died holding hands, but because they chose to live together, holding on to everything they'd almost lost. For months after the voyage, Titanic reunions became a phenomenon. First in New York, then in London, Paris, and Chicago. Passengers found each other, exchanged letters, met in tearful embraces. Bonds had formed on that ship that even time couldn't loosen. Strangers who had shared a near end etched into memory now greeted each other like old friends. Photos were taken. Toasts were made. Some even joked about planning a return voyage together. Titanic 2, they called it, not realizing the irony would deepen with time. But amid all the reflection, a question floated quietly in the background, like a phantom drifting just beneath the surface. What if? What if the iceberg had been closer? What if the engines had stalled? What if the crew had hesitated for 1 second longer? It wasn't guilt, not exactly, but an awareness, a silent agreement among those who had been there, that life was not owed, but borrowed. That even the grandest ship in the world sailed at the mercy of seconds and snow. The world, of course, was moving too quickly to dwell on caution. Other ships launched. Bigger, faster, bolder. The Olympic, Titanic's sister ship, was fitted with even grander furnishings. The Britannic, still in planning stages, was being discussed as a possible floating city of the future. The shipping industry doubled down on its pride. "We build them well," one executive declared. "And now we have proof." But not everyone celebrated. In quiet corners of the maritime world, engineers and safety experts met in dimly lit rooms, pointing to charts and schematics. "We were lucky," they warned. "Next time, we might not be." Their voices were polite, professional, easy to ignore. After all, nothing had gone wrong, right? Back in Belfast, where Titanic had been born, workers painted the slipway she once occupied with a proud plaque. Tourists came to see where the legend began. Children climbed onto the iron rails. Old men told stories about how they'd helped hammer the rivets that held her together. And somewhere in a small home not far from that dockyard, a retired shipbuilder named Thomas Andrews sat quietly by the fire. He had been on that maiden voyage, had felt the shudder through the floorboards, had walked the halls as the ship swerved and steadied. In another life, in another timeline, he never came home. But here, he did, and he carried a different kind of weight. Not sorrow, not guilt, but purpose. He knew the ship had been strong, but not invincible. He knew how close they had come, so he began writing letters, notes, proposals, all outlining improvements, not because the world demanded them, but because he knew the world eventually would. Because Thomas Andrews wasn't thinking about what had happened. He was thinking about the next ship. Summer came to the Atlantic like a sigh of relief. The sea, once the backdrop for a near tragedy, now shimmered beneath cloudless skies as the Titanic prepared for her second voyage. Tickets sold out faster this time. Everyone wanted to sail on the ship that had outwitted fate. She was no longer just a marvel of luxury and engineering. She was a survivor. To set foot on her decks was to touch a legend in motion. The passengers boarding in Southampton weren't all the same as before. Some were returning travelers, eager to ride her again. Some were new, drawn by her growing fame. And some came just to say they had. On her grand staircase, voices echoed with excitement. In the smoking lounges, men in pressed suits traded exaggerated accounts of how close she'd come. And on the open decks, women clutched parasols and posed for photographs with a smile that said, "We are part of history now." What few of them noticed was how subtly different the crew seemed this time. Not in uniforms, not in manner, but in the way they moved. A little sharper, a little more aware. The iceberg had missed its mark, but its shadow remained. In the hearts of those who had felt the shudder, who had heard the scraping steel, the sea was no longer a tame path to a new world. It was a living thing, and it remembered. Thomas Andrews had returned as well. Against the advice of friends and family, he insisted. Not because he craved attention, but because he needed to see for himself, to walk the halls, to feel the floor beneath his feet, to stand in the boiler rooms and know they were whole. He kept a notebook tucked inside his coat, and in quiet corners he wrote about ventilation systems, bulkhead reinforcements, and the importance of longer lifeboat drills. He still believed in Titanic, but belief, he had learned, didn't mean blindness. The voyage passed without incident. No ice, no storms, no midnight gasps. Just calm waters and gentle fog. But even peace has its price. Because each smooth crossing reinforced the idea that Titanic was not just unsinkable, but unchallengeable. By autumn, White Star Line was exploring the idea of expanding the Olympic-class fleet. A new vessel, they whispered, even grander than Titanic. A floating cathedral. Talks of onboard theaters, electric elevators, gardens under glass domes. The race for prestige was on. Cunard, their chief rival, had plans too. The war of tonnage, speed, and glamour had only just begun. Meanwhile, back in the drawing rooms of London and the boardrooms of New York, maritime safety remained little more than a footnote. A few minor updates here and there, an extra wireless operator on some ships, a modest proposal to extend lookout training. But nothing sweeping, nothing urgent, because the Titanic had proven that even when struck, she could endure. That confidence, quiet and insidious, took root. And yet, the sea doesn't forget. In a coastal town in Newfoundland, a sailor named Jonathan Bell kept a journal. He'd been fishing the waters near where Titanic had passed on her fateful route. That same night, he had seen something. A chunk of ice, freshly cracked, drifting far from the main field. He had written in his journal, "Lucky for them, the current carried it west." He clipped the newspaper the next day, kept it pressed between the pages. In his village, they told stories about the sea, how it gives and takes, how it tests and teaches, and how, when its lesson is ignored, it returns with a louder voice. But those voices were drowned in applause. Titanic had become more than a ship. She was a stage, and the world had cast her as proof of progress. Children drew pictures of her in school books. Artists painted her prow against golden skies. Postcards sold by the thousands. In theaters, short films depicted her voyage. Actors in uniforms reenacted the moment she swerved past the iceberg. A string quartet played softly in the background and the audience held its breath, even though they knew the ending. Because that was the thrill. They knew she would survive. They always knew. And somewhere in the back of those theaters, in the quiet corners of ships and in the private thoughts of survivors, a question began to grow. What if we hadn't? It was never voiced aloud. Not yet, but it lingered. Beneath the polish, beneath the celebrations, beneath the flags fluttering from the mast, there was a sliver of truth cutting through the heart of every steel plate. They had been lucky, only lucky, and luck as any sailor knows, runs out. Thomas Andrews knew it best. On Titanic's third voyage, he stayed behind in Belfast. His notes had grown thick, detailed, specific. He had submitted them to the board: design improvements, operational drills, wireless redundancy, better emergency protocols. Some of the suggestions were acknowledged. Fewer were implemented. When asked by a reporter why he wasn't aboard again, Andrews simply said, "She needs no more applause. She needs attention." But attention was harder to sell than wonder. On the fourth crossing, Titanic was more luxurious than ever. New chandeliers sparkled in the dining saloon. A fresh string ensemble played a revised menu of waltzes. A swimming pool had been repainted in soft blues, and menus offered exotic dishes few passengers could pronounce. She was no longer just a ship. She was a floating world. And those who had once gasped at her near demise now came aboard only to boast they had done so. No longer did passengers gather to talk about the iceberg. They talked about the chef, about the tea service, about the softness of the linens. The brush with death was now a tale best saved for after dessert. But far away, deep in colder waters, the ice waited. It didn't move quickly. It didn't need to. The sea has no deadlines, only memory. By the time Titanic sailed on her fifth voyage, her name had transcended steel and steam. She was no longer just a ship. She was a brand, a myth still in motion. The name Titanic now adorned luggage, tea tins, even board games. Children reenacted her iceberg dodge in the streets, turning catastrophe into play. Shopkeepers displayed her portrait beside Union Jacks, and her theme, the near disaster turned deliverance, echoed across oceans. The story had become polished, smoothed by repetition. Titanic, the ship that could not be sunk. The ship that bested nature. The ship that proved mankind's mastery of the sea. But in Belfast, there were those who still held their breath each time she set sail. In the Harland and Wolff shipyard, where Titanic had first emerged under gray skies and crane arms, the workers followed her journeys like anxious parents. Not because they doubted her strength, but because they knew strength was never the whole story. Thomas Andrews, who had since stepped back from public interviews, kept his routine simple. Mornings at the docks, afternoons reviewing ship plans, nights writing. In letters to colleagues, he wrote less now about rivets and steel thickness, and more about behavior. Human behavior. Overconfidence, he believed, would always be the iceberg no one saw coming. Meanwhile, on board Titanic herself, things felt like a dream that refused to end. Each new voyage brought new luxury. The ship had become a traveling stage for the elite. Politicians, actors, financiers, they didn't just ride her, they wore her like a badge. If you had sailed the Titanic, you were someone. And if you hadn't, well, perhaps next season. In first class, old friends from the original crossing reunited. They laughed about the bump in the night, trading details as if they were war veterans. "My glass never even tipped," one man said. "I kept eating my lamb as though nothing happened." Their voices carried through the smoking lounge, rising with the scent of cigars and port wine. In second class, aspiring writers and engineers dreamed aloud. Titanic had become a symbol of ambition, and to sail her was to step closer to the life they wanted. "She makes you believe," one said quietly, staring out the porthole, "that the world might actually be kind." But down in third class, far from the polished railings and monogrammed linens, the mood remained more grounded. For many of these passengers, Titanic was not legend. It was luck, a chance, a crossing between what was and what could be. They sang songs, passed around flasks, shared prayers in different tongues, and sometimes late at night someone would ask, "Did you hear what almost happened on her first voyage?" The question hung in the air like smoke. They knew the story. Everyone did. But saying it aloud made it real. And real things, as the sea often reminded them, could be taken away. As the ship sailed on, the world around her changed. Europe was beginning to shift. Politics grew brittle. Newspapers hinted at conflicts brewing across borders. In drawing rooms, conversations turned cautious. Still, Titanic remained untouched. Above it all, she became a sort of sanctuary, a place where time slowed and worries couldn't reach. A place where the future hadn't arrived yet. And then came a crossing that would change everything. Not because of what happened on board, but because of who was on it. Among the passengers was a young man named Franklin Brewster, an industrialist's son, sent to Europe to negotiate new trade routes for his father's shipping company. He had the polished look of someone born into money, but a restless energy beneath it. He asked too many questions, drank more tea than whiskey, and instead of mingling with the rich, he spent his time with the crew, especially the engineers. He wanted to understand the ship, every corridor, every pump, every protocol. And what he found startled him. One night, during a tour of the engine rooms, he asked what would happen if the wireless failed during a real emergency. The chief operator smiled, confident. "We're not the Carpathia, lad. We are the Titanic." It wasn't arrogance, it was belief. Titanic had endured once. She would endure again. Brewster wrote notes in his journal that night. Notes he would later turn into a 32-page report that no one at the White Star Line wanted to read. He warned of assumptions. He pointed to delayed lifeboat drills, crew fatigue, over-reliance on previous luck. "We've confused survivability with invincibility," he wrote. "And that distinction may one day cost us dearly." His words were dismissed as overcautious. "The ship has proved herself," they said. "Let's not chase shadows." But shadows, by nature, don't need permission to fall. Later that year, a White Star liner, not Titanic, ran into heavy fog and collided with a smaller vessel. No lives were lost, but the panic that followed rippled through the industry. It was enough to restart debates, enough to reintroduce phrases like emergency procedure and radio silence, enough to make people nervous. But Titanic kept sailing. In winter, she returned to Europe under a snowfall that glittered on her upper decks. Her funnels billowed against gray skies as children threw snowballs and couples drank brandy beneath fur blankets. There was still music, still laughter, still belief. But something had shifted. A pause before toasts, a glance at lifeboats, a second thought before stepping aboard. Even myths must breathe. And Titanic was beginning to exhale. As she steamed back toward New York once again, her lights glowing against the darkening sea, no one aboard knew what lay ahead, only that the world felt different than when she first left it. In the distance, winter deepened. Ice gathered silently on the northern currents. The water grew colder. The sea remembered. The Atlantic never speaks, but it remembers. It remembers the pressure of steel hulls against its currents, the weight of promises floating atop its waves, the silence of mistakes repeated. By the spring of 1914, the Titanic had crossed the ocean 10 times without incident since her famous brush with death. Her name was now a fixture of global luxury, uttered in the same breath as royalty and opulence. Her dining rooms were fully booked months in advance. Her name stitched on luggage tags felt like a passport to another world. But beneath the elegance, cracks were forming, not in her body but in the culture that surrounded her. Crew turnover had increased. The original officers who had steered her past the iceberg had taken other posts or retired, and with them, a quiet sense of vigilance faded. Those who replaced them knew the ship only as a legend, not as the vessel that had once creaked under pressure in the dead of night. Training remained thorough, but confidence often blurred the line between preparation and performance. For some, it felt like a theater play repeating its most famous act. The iceberg had become a story told for effect, stripped of its weight. In the Marconi room, where wireless signals once pulsed with urgency, the younger operators occasionally reenacted that night for guests. SOS, they joked, stands for Save Our Steak. The laughter it drew masked the unease in those who still remembered the real tension of static-filled uncertainty. But the joke always landed, because who could imagine danger on a ship that had already outrun it? In those same months, world headlines grew darker. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was making official visits across Europe. The Balkans trembled with unrest. In cafes from Paris to Berlin, the conversations began to shift, from fashion and travel to alliances and rumors. War was no longer unthinkable. It had simply become uncomfortable. Titanic sailed on. One particular voyage that spring brought together a collection of minds that history would never have allowed to meet, at least not in the world we know. Aboard were an Austrian diplomat, a German industrialist, an American suffragist, and a Russian poet. They dined within sight of each other. They spoke across cultural and linguistic lines, perhaps clumsily, but with curiosity. Their presence on the same ship wasn't coincidence, it was testimony. The Titanic had become a floating salon for the world's ambitious, curious, and connected. The ocean was no longer a barrier, it was a stage. And this ship, with its mirrored halls and velvet chairs, played host to dreams bigger than nations. But there were whispers, quiet conversations behind cabin doors. A steward overheard one guest ask another, "Would you sail her in wartime?" The response came slowly. If war breaks out, even the Titanic can't promise smooth waters. The sea itself during those crossings had changed. Icebergs drifted farther south than usual. The spring melt had come early, pushing frozen giants into shipping lanes. The International Ice Patrol, never fully established since the Titanic had survived, had no formal presence. Reports of ice were shared sporadically, left to the discretion of each ship's captain. One foggy morning, Titanic passed within half a mile of a floe so wide it resembled a floating island. Passengers on the upper decks leaned over to marvel at it. A relic from that night, someone quipped. But those who understood the waters did not smile. The iceberg shimmered, patient and real as the ship slid past, its engines humming like distant thunder. Later that evening, Captain Robert Massey, who had recently taken command of Titanic, stood at the bridge watching the horizon. He'd studied the ship's past in detail, knew every report, every diagram. But he also knew how quickly knowledge turned to assumption. He ordered a course shift, just enough to avoid the heaviest flow clusters. Some questioned the decision. "It's calm," they said. "We've been through worse." But Massey's eyes remained on the water. He knew that calm seas didn't mean safe ones. That danger, when it came, rarely knocked. In first class, the mood remained indulgent. A masquerade ball was planned for the following night, and the ship's grand staircase had been dressed in gold ribbon and paper blossoms. The orchestra rehearsed a new waltz. Waiters practiced synchronized service. The iceberg near miss was already becoming an anecdote, a line to slip into conversation between courses. Only a few passengers paused to wonder. An elderly French widow, Madame Eloise Delacour, wrote in her diary that night, "We play at luxury on this ship, as if nothing in the world can touch us. But outside these windows is a world we do not control. I wonder if the Titanic has not shielded us so well that we've forgotten how fragile we really are." She would later become a voice of rare clarity when her journals were published decades later. At the time, her thoughts stayed ink on paper, folded between silk scarves in a leather case. Meanwhile, in the wireless room, a garbled signal came through from a Norwegian cargo ship. Heavy ice reported. Low visibility. Titanic acknowledged the message. No action was taken. It was habit now, routine. Ice was part of the sea, like waves and stars. Back in Belfast, Thomas Andrews stood outside the Harland and Wolff offices staring at the sky. He had just received word of Titanic's 10th successful return to New York. The letter was short, congratulatory, but it felt hollow. He didn't want another voyage. He wanted change. He opened a drawer, pulled out a binder. Inside were proposals, reinforced compartments, more lifeboats, redesigned evacuation protocols, and a bold idea, a new class of lifeboat that could be launched even if the ship listed to one side. His colleagues reviewed them with politeness, with indifference. "She hasn't failed us yet, Thomas." No, she hadn't. But he feared she had lulled them into believing she never could. The Titanic prepared to return across the Atlantic once more. passengers took their places. Photographers boarded. The band tuned its strings. A new menu was printed. And far to the north, an iceberg drifted silently through a gray fog. Unaware, unchanging, waiting. The Titanic departed from New York on what was now her 11th voyage with little fanfare. By this point, her sailings were routine, almost mundane. She had become so familiar in the public imagination that newspapers reported her departures with the same casual confidence reserved for rail timetables. She was still majestic, still magnificent, but no longer mysterious. She was, as the world believed, infallible. On board, life resumed its usual rhythm. The hum of the engines, the clink of cutlery, the rustle of silk in the hallways, all part of a luxury experience that no longer surprised, only satisfied. The magic had not vanished, but it had dulled into ritual. Captain Massey stood on the bridge watching the crew at work, their movements efficient, practiced. He checked the weather reports, calm. The latest Marconi traffic, unremarkable. A few ships had reported colder temperatures and floating ice in the north shipping lanes, but nothing urgent. He marked it mentally, as he always did, but didn't change course. No need, not on Titanic. That night, dinner in first class was particularly lavish. An anniversary celebration for a British banker and his wife drew the attention of the entire dining room. Champagne flowed. Toasts echoed beneath the chandeliers. The band played a new waltz by a young composer from Vienna. Waiters glided between tables with precision honed over a dozen voyages. In second class, passengers passed cards and shared gossip. A pair of American schoolteachers speculated about whether the rumors of war in Europe would interfere with their summer plans. "If it does," one of them said, sipping tea, "at least we've got one good story to tell." Down in third class, families kept to themselves, clustered around tables and warm bowls of stew. The talk here was quieter, about relatives in Chicago, about finding work in Boston, about the strange calm of the sea, how flat the waters had been for days. An old man muttered something in Irish about still water and unlucky signs. Most ignored him. As midnight approached, the ship sailed through fog. A low, creeping mist that wrapped around her like gauze. The lookout could barely see more than 100 feet ahead. He rang the bell twice, then once more, and adjusted his scarf. It was colder than usual. At the bridge, Massey squinted into the dark. The temperature had dropped suddenly. Breath turned to vapor. Still no sign of anything unusual on the horizon. The Marconi room crackled with life. A nearby steamer sent a brief message. Heavy field ice ahead. Proceed with caution. Phillips, the operator, glanced at the clock, logged the note, and slid the paper into a growing pile. He would deliver it after his break. It wasn't urgent. Ice warnings had become so common they barely stirred reaction anymore, like background noise in a city. You noticed it, but only when it was gone. Back in the lower decks, a young steward named Michael Ellis walked the hall with a lamp, checking doors. He paused at a bulkhead and touched it. Cold, not cool. Cold enough that his fingertips flinched. He frowned and made a mental note to mention it to the engineer. Above him, the party continued. At precisely 12:07 a.m., a soft, grinding sound vibrated through the forward section of the ship. It was not loud, not the dramatic crunch people might expect. It was more like a deep sigh, the kind the sea makes when it's reminded that something heavy has disturbed its surface. On the promenade deck, a passenger paused mid-sentence. "Did you hear?" And then silence. The engines didn't stop. The lights didn't flicker. There was no shouting, no alarms. Just a ship pressing forward through the dark, unaware that beneath her, something ancient had awoken. The iceberg they struck had been wider than expected, lower in the water. A shelf, worn smooth by time and tide. When the ship brushed against it, the hull flexed. Not catastrophically, but enough. Enough for rivets to groan and plates to bow. Water seeped in, slowly at first, through seams that had never been tested under such a prolonged drag. Below deck, Michael Ellis saw the first sign of it, a thin stream pooling near a storage hold. He tapped the pipe nearby, thinking it had cracked. But the pipe was dry. The water was not. By 12:21 a.m., word had reached the bridge. "We've taken on some water forward, sir. Possibly a burst intake. Engineers are checking it now." Captain Massey nodded, calm, alert. He ordered a reduction in speed, sent word to the engine room, made a note to request a full systems inspection once they cleared the fog. It was nothing serious, yet. At 12:32 a.m., a second report arrived. More water, compartment 5, rising faster than expected. The ship still moved evenly. No list, no tremble. But Massey knew the numbers. The compartments weren't breached in dramatic fashion. There was no flood pouring in like in the stories. No one panicked. But the sea didn't need panic. It needed only time. By 1 a.m., the waterline was above the lowest stairwell in the forward cargo bay. Andrews would later write that if the ship hadn't been designed to survive 4 flooded compartments, this moment would have tipped her fate. But she had been. Barely. Orders were issued for preliminary lifeboat checks. Not deployment, just readiness. Crew moved with quiet urgency. Passengers slept, unaware. In the Marconi room, Phillips finally delivered the earlier ice warning. Massey read it in silence. He didn't blame the delay. He simply stared at the date and the timestamp, then folded the paper into his pocket. The ship was not in danger. Not yet. But this was the moment, Massey would later recall, when confidence gave way to caution. He walked the deck himself, felt the cold in his lungs, listened to the foghorn calling out into emptiness. And then he made a decision. Change course, head south, reduce speed to half. Notify all ships in the area of suspected ice flow spread. No need to alarm passengers, but no more waiting. That decision, quiet and deliberate, would echo louder than anyone knew. Titanic would not sink that night, but the sea had tapped once again, and someone finally had listened. By morning, the fog had lifted, and so had the unease, at least for the passengers. The sun sparkled off calm waters, casting the illusion that nothing had happened. On deck, women in wide hats resumed their strolls. Children played with spinning tops. In the dining saloons, fresh linens replaced the ones from the night before, and breakfast was served with its usual flourish. But below the surface, both literal and emotional, things had shifted. Captain Massey remained composed, his orders the night before executed with seamless precision. The ship had slowed, changed course, and slipped past the worst of the ice. Officially, it was logged as a precaution. Nothing dramatic, nothing to concern the public. But among the senior crew, there was no mistaking the tone. It had been a warning shot. Thomas Andrews heard about the incident from an old colleague aboard who wired him a cryptic message. She passed the test again. Barely. Andrews sat with it in his study in Belfast, staring at the window while the message hung on the air like frost. The ship was strong. Yes. But something inside him knew this could not go on forever. No ship, no crew, no human plan could forever dance between timing and fortune without consequence. The next day, he penned an article, never published, called The Illusion of Safety. It was part memoir, part technical proposal, part plea. In it, he described Titanic not as a failure of engineering or triumph of design, but as a symbol of the blind spot between what we build and how we behave. A ship survives not only by what it's made of, he wrote, but by the humility of those who command her. But that humility still had not reached everyone. In London, the White Star Line's executive board met to discuss future upgrades. They noted the night's fog encounter with barely a shrug. Massey had done his job. The ship remained intact. All was well. One board member even suggested that Titanic ES' next promotional run could include a new slogan, Even nature can deter her path. The marketing team loved it. The engineers said nothing. Back on Titanic, word of the slowed speed and the change of course eventually reached the passengers in hushed tones. Some laughed it off. "Our captain's just cautious," one man said at lunch. "Wouldn't you be, with a ship this expensive?" A few raised eyebrows. A few more exchanged glances. Madame Eloise Delacour, who had now taken to keeping a quiet vigil on the ship's promenade, felt the air that morning settle just a little heavier on her shoulders. She'd sensed something. The crew's silence, the altered rhythm of the ship's motion, the way the fog had seemed to press in and then retreat, as if deciding whether to speak. In her diary, she wrote, "There is a moment after danger passes where the soul still trembles. I think Titanic is trembling beneath her marble and brass." Phillips, the wireless operator, was less poetic, but no less shaken. He finally brought the earlier warnings to the captain in person, asking whether he'd failed to act quickly enough. Massey looked at him and said, "You acted within expectations. But expectations must change." Those 4 words, "expectations must change," would be quoted in later speeches, inscribed at maritime academies, repeated by officers in training decades later. But at that time, they were just a quiet shift in mindset, spoken by a captain to a young man still learning the weight of decisions. Meanwhile, in the press back home, early rumors of the ship's fog encounter were leaked, framed not as a concern, but as a thrill. "Titanic weathers the veil," wrote one headline. "Another icy test for the Queen of the Sea." Readers devoured it. The ship's myth only grew. With every obstacle she survived, her invincibility hardened into legend. But legends, by nature, make us careless. A few weeks after her return, a less celebrated cargo ship from Liverpool struck ice and had to be evacuated. It wasn't a mass casualty event, just one ship, mostly crew, but it triggered whispers, questions. Why hadn't it been better prepared? Why wasn't there a faster response? The answers, of course, were complicated. Because Titanic had lived, the world believed all ships could. Because Titanic had survived, the urgency to improve had been dulled. And now, finally, the consequences began to rise like a slow tide. In Parliament, a young MP named Jonathan Miles called for a full maritime safety audit, citing a false sense of security instilled by the survival of one ship, however grand. He was shouted down, but not silenced. Others had begun to listen. Titanic herself prepared for another voyage. Preparations were underway for a summer cruise unlike any before. A voyage for diplomats, celebrities, thinkers, and politicians. An elite roster was being curated. Leaders from France, the U.S., and Britain invited to sail together across the Atlantic on what was being unofficially dubbed the Peace Voyage. The idea was ambitious. Bring together figures from countries at odds and let them share a ship for 5 days. Break bread, talk politics, build bridges and ballrooms. But beneath the vision lay a quiet gamble. That proximity could prevent war. That this ship, could become more than transport. It could be a floating solution. And Titanic, still majestic, still unbroken, still bathed in the gold of her own myth, would carry them. As work began on refurbishing her for the voyage, Massey sent a final report to White Star headquarters. It was brief, carefully worded, but firm. It ended with a single sentence. "If this ship is to carry the burden of history, let us not forget what nearly became of her in its earliest pages." And far to the north, in the late hours of night, a satellite image taken over the Atlantic showed a dense cluster of icebergs drifting farther south than expected. They were unnamed, untracked, and waiting. The summer of 1914 arrived not with warmth, but with weight. In salons and embassies, people spoke in careful tones. In newspapers, words like mobilization, ultimatum, and tensions escalate became daily fixtures. Archduke Franz Ferdinand's motorcade in Sarajevo had not yet driven into history, but the storm clouds were already forming above Europe, And yet, in Southampton, the Titanic prepared to sail once more, refitted, refurnished, reimagined for a new kind of mission. The peace voyage, as it was now formally called, had gathered unprecedented attention. Statesmen, diplomats, scholars, even a few monarchists and social critics, all bound for New York aboard the ship that refused to sink. The world, spinning faster and darker by the day, looked to Titanic with cautious hope. Maybe 5 days at sea could achieve what years of summits and telegrams had not. Maybe the dining rooms and promenades could melt away old rivalries. Maybe if leaders could look one another in the eyes, they would not point guns at each other's nations. The symbolism was clear. Titanic had once defied nature. Now, perhaps, she could help defy war. Preparations were meticulous. The dining menu was curated to include French, Austrian, Serbian, and Russian dishes. The ballroom, normally used for formal dances, was converted into a space for round-table discussion. A glass panel was installed over part of the engine room below, so guests could peer into the literal heart of progress, of movement, of forward motion. Captain Massey remained in command, but now his face appeared in papers. He was more than a seaman. He had become a kind of philosopher captain. Calm, disciplined, respected even by those who had never set foot on a ship. Reporters asked him, on the eve of departure, whether he believed the voyage could achieve peace. He paused and replied, "I don't command diplomacy, but I command the deck. And while aboard my ship, I hope they'll remember the ocean is vast, and yet we all cross it in the same vessel." The quote ran on front pages across 3 continents. On board, Madame Eloise Delacour returned, invited this time as a private correspondent for a European periodical. She took the same stateroom, sat by the same window, and once again brought her journal. In it, she wrote, "The men above me may speak of peace, but I believe the sea already knows the answer. We speak of preventing disaster, yet we ignore the quiet fact that we are always only one night away from it." The ship departed under clear skies. From the docks, a band played a symphony written for the occasion. Children waved flags. Diplomats clutched portfolios. Some smiled, some did not. Among the guests was a young Serbian envoy named Luka Radic. Barely 30, he had been pulled into politics more by necessity than ambition. The voyage, he said, was a chance to listen, to breathe, to speak without walls. On the first night, he dined beside a Hungarian noble, a British admiral, and an American industrialist. They laughed, they toasted. They disagreed on nearly everything, but they did so without drawing swords. And the Titanic, steady and golden in the dark, pressed forward. Out at sea, the waters remained unusually calm. The wind mild, but the air turned colder each night. On the second day, the wireless room buzzed with updates. Troop movements, letters to editors, border skirmishes that weren't being called that yet. Captain Massey read the logs, shared a few with key passengers, and kept the rest in a locked drawer. His primary focus remained the voyage, the ship, the safety of all aboard. But still, he walked the decks more often now, stared longer at the horizon. On the third night, the fog returned. Not the drifting mist of previous journeys, but a thick, swallowing curtain that reduced visibility to almost nothing. Foghorns sounded their low, mournful cry into nothingness. The ship slowed. Spotters doubled their shifts. Engineers watched pressure gauges with a kind of reverence. Some passengers remained unaware. Deep in heated discussion, they debated trade routes and territorial claims. They smoked cigars and called one another friend, even as they dissected generations of resentment. But others noticed the way the fog seemed to press against the windows, how the ship's horn made the silverware tremble slightly, how the crew smiled, but not with their eyes. Below deck, a junior officer named Harold Reeves stood beside a lifeboat and exhaled slowly into the mist. He'd never seen fog like this, and though he'd trained extensively, read every manual, run every drill, he found himself gripping the rail just a little tighter. That same night, a warning came through from a Norwegian freighter. Massive ice field drifted south, visibility near zero. Advised southern route change immediately. Massey received it. His brow creased, and without hesitation he ordered another change of course. deeper south than planned. This decision would be ridiculed by some of the guests. "We'll be late," one diplomat grumbled. "Peace doesn't wait for weather." But Massey ignored them. He had sailed too long. He knew when the sea whispered instead of roared, and so Titanic veered south. The fog thinned, the water warmed, and the ship reached calmer seas by dawn. No one aboard would ever know just how close they'd come. Again. Just hours behind them, the ice field spread like a jagged net across the shipping lane. A smaller liner attempting to maintain speed had already reported hull damage. No fatalities, but enough to make the headlines back home. Titanic remained untouched. The voyage continued. By the final night, as the lights of the American coast became visible to the east, a quiet fell over the ship. The conversation slowed. The laughter softened. And somewhere inside, each passenger understood what the voyage had meant. Not just in speeches, but in silence. 5 days together, no war declared, no crisis ignited, no ice beneath their feet. They had crossed something larger than an ocean. When Titanic docked in New York, no band played, no cannons roared, just quiet, and then applause. They stepped off the ship like pilgrims returning from a world apart. One by one, the delegates disembarked beneath a late summer sky in New York. Their faces bore the fatigue of long discussions and time zone shifts, but also a subtle calm, like travelers who had glimpsed something rare and knew it might not come again. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping treaties signed on the deck. But as Madame Eloise Delacour would later write in her final dispatch, "It was not peace we built, but the memory of peace, and that, perhaps, is more lasting." Captain Massey shook hands with each guest as they left. Luka Radic, the young Serbian envoy, offered him a quiet smile and pressed a folded note into his palm. It read, in neat ink, "Your course correction saved more than lives. It saved dignity." The note was never published, but Massey kept it in his coat until the day he retired. The press arrived late, disoriented by the ship's earlier-than-expected arrival due to the southern detour. By the time they gathered on the docks, the moment had already passed into history. Inside the ship's staterooms, stewards gathered forgotten handkerchiefs, misplaced telegrams, and half-finished drafts of speeches that would never be read. On a writing desk in a quiet cabin, a single sheet of paper remained. It was titled, simply, "What We Didn't Say." In the following days, photos circulated. Politicians photographed arm in arm. Journalists published soft praise. Headlines leaned optimistic, if uncertain. Progress afloat. A voyage without enemies. The Titanic brings them together, for now. But even as the ink dried, the world shifted. June came, and then Sarajevo. A bullet in a car on a quiet street cracked through the surface of diplomacy, and with it, the illusion that time was still on anyone's side. The peace voyage became a footnote. The Titanic, for all her grace, could not outrun history forever. War came. Not in skirmishes or scattered conflicts, but in waves. Europe burned. Alliances snapped tight. Letters that once passed between friendly delegates aboard Titanic now came sealed with official warnings and icy distance. Men who had shared wine in the ship's dining saloon now sat on opposite ends of war rooms, making decisions that would shatter cities. And Titanic? She was recalled, not to carry diplomats, but soldiers. Her grand staterooms, once filled with chamber music and soft conversation, were gutted for cots and rations. Her gleaming promenades were lined with stretchers. Her crew, seasoned and proud, adapted with discipline and restraint. The myth became machine. She sailed under escort now. Flags subdued, windows blacked out. Yet, even then, she remained unsunk. Each voyage she carried not the wealthy and influential but the wounded and weary. Across the same ocean, under the same stars. One soldier, writing home from her infirmary deck in 1916, scribbled, "They say this ship was once royalty. Now she's a nurse, but she still floats. So do I." During the Great War, the Titanic made 8 military runs. She was struck once, torpedoed near the coast of Ireland, but the blow was shallow. Her reinforced hull, strengthened in peacetime at Andrew's urging, held. She limped home, scarred but alive. When the war ended, she was returned to her owners. No longer the newest, no longer the grandest, but legendary in a way no brochure could sell. They offered to retire her, turn her into a museum, a symbol. But she sailed again, not for fame now or money, but because some ships, like some stories, must be lived through to their end. She became a transatlantic liner once more, slower, older, but respected. Families boarded her because their grandparents had. Students walked her decks whispering that she'd survived 2 world-shifting tides. And Eloise Delacour, she never boarded her again, but she kept the deck plans framed above her writing desk. On quiet evenings, when the noise of the new century pressed too close, she would trace the outlines with her fingers and whisper, "She was never just iron. She was a witness." In her memoir, Crossings, published in 1933, she wrote, "We expected Titanic to break records, to deliver luxury, to awe the world. But what she gave us, unexpectedly, repeatedly, was a reminder that history is not a line, but a tide, that we are never promised tomorrow, but we are often given the chance to reach it." She died in her sleep that same year. Titanic's final commercial voyage came in 1935. Age and cost caught up with her. She was docked quietly in Southampton for several months, unsure of her fate. Public campaigns pleaded for preservation. Children wrote poems. Veterans sent letters. "Don't scrap our unsinkable ship," one man wrote. "She's the last thing that stayed afloat when everything else went down." Eventually, she was bought by a private foundation, restored, and moored permanently as a floating museum. She never sailed again, but she was never forgotten. Visitors walked her decks, touched the railings, stood at the very bow where so many photos had been taken. Some wept, some smiled. All felt something, because Titanic didn't sink, and because she didn't, history was bent, just slightly toward a different shape. And so, the great ship sailed on, not into myth shaped by tragedy, but into a gentler legend, carved by choices, by wisdom, and by grace. In this quiet corner of imagination, where ice turned aside and time slowed just enough to let lives continue, we glimpse not just what was possible, but what might always be within reach. A world where caution is not cowardice, where strength lies in humility, and where even the largest vessel dares to change its course when the stars suggest danger. Titanic didn't rise from the depths in this story, because she never fell. She remained, weathered but proud, not because of her size or wealth, but because someone listened. Someone slowed down. Someone chose life over pride. Perhaps that is the truest lesson, that the course of history is shaped not by grand declarations, but by quiet decisions made in the dark. A delayed message delivered, a small turn of the wheel, a captain who refused to race forward simply because he could. And maybe that is how we carry this story forward in our own lives, by remembering that it is never too late to pause, to reroute, to protect what matters most. Because in every life, there are icebergs we cannot see, and choices that just might save us. Thank you for sailing through this story with us, through calm waters and uncertain fog, through what was and what might have been. May your journey tonight be gentle, your dreams deep, and your imagination always open to new possibilities. Until we meet again in the next tale, this is Echoes of What If, wishing you peace, wonder, and warm waters ahead. Good night.